So welcome everyone. So hopefully you're in the right place. This is the Critical AI Literacy in Time of Chatbots Symposium. And this session is the one on critical AI literacy. What is it and why do we need it? I'm the moderator today. I am a professor of practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo. So my main role is as an educational developer. So I support other people in their teaching generally. And I have a background in computer science with my PhDs in education. So I thought when ChatGPT came around, that was like, oh, okay, I've got the background for this thing. All right, and with us today, we have three panelists. We have Matthew Stone, Antonio Hamilton, and Lauren Goodlad. Matthew is a professor of computer science and cognitive science at Recent Research, has explored ways of extending data-driven AI techniques to capture common sense features of communication, such as its goal-directed organization, topical coherence, and real-world reference. Matthew has a long-standing involvement in fostering interdisciplinary training in AI at Rutgers, including roles in NSF-funded graduate programs in perceptual science and socially cognizant robotics. And this is giving me lots of ideas for what my institution should do in terms of interdisciplinary work on AI. Antonio Hamilton is a PhD student in English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And his research is very current. He centers on the impact that old, current, and new evolving automated writing technologies have on a writer's identity and development. So he is also interested in the potential impact of these technologies on writing more broadly, specifically how automated and generative AI writing may promote more standardized English writing and deprioritize diverse writing styles, which is also one of my interests because I teach at English language institution where the majority of the students are non-native speakers. And Lauren Goodlad, last but not least, Lauren, if you haven't heard of Lauren and you're here, I'm very surprised. But Lauren is a distinguished professor of English and comparative literature at Rutgers, and she's the chair of critical AI at Rutgers and the editor of Critical AI, which is the journal that Rebecca mentioned earlier. And with Matthew Stone and others, she's a PI for Design Justice AI, a global humanities institute that will take place at the University of Pretoria in July 2024. And she's the lead PI for Design Justice Labs, an NEH grant devoted to building critical AI literacy and critical AI studies. And so we're going to start in the order of just folks. You all have about 20 minutes to do your thing. And we'll check the questions in the Q&A. And hopefully from there, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, please, and then I'll curate. Go ahead, Matthew.
Good morning, everybody, and or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm very conscious of the diversity of this audience, which is fantastic. But it means that almost certainly some of you will find this basic and others of you might find it fast. I'm just trying to set the stage for our conversations today by developing a shared vocabulary for what it is that large language models do, where they come from, what uses they have, and what their sort of strengths and weaknesses are. Over the course of the talk, I'll put some pins and some points that we can bring up again in the Q&A perhaps, if we want to dive into some more technical details. So a language model is just a data-driven procedure that computes a score for text and context. So you give this model some context, you give it a text, and it outputs a number. That number quantifies how good the text is in context as a plausible or appropriate continuation. Now, there's obviously a big difference between a plausible and an appropriate continuation. And one of the things that's sort of exciting and bewildering about the technology is the shifting meanings that the scores output by language models have had as the technology evolves. But let's just start with a simple example. So you type in a context like in silent exhaustion, Robin and Terry returned to the kitchen. And then you ask, so in that context, how plausible or appropriate would the continuation be? They started dictionary, chopping onions and garlic. Well, that's the kind of thing that people do when they're exhausted and return to the kitchen, and it's a fluid and natural English sentence. You'd hope that the language model would assign this a high score if it's really capturing knowledge of English. Meanwhile, you could give it a different, weirder text. Suddenly, the lobster ricocheted out of the centrifuge. Well, you wouldn't, maybe you'd expect a lobster in the kitchen, but certainly not a centrifuge. And so like this is starting to get weird. You'd hope that the language model would assign this a lower score. It's just, but there's lots of ways that text can be strange or unusual. And this is just, in some sense, the tip of the iceberg. So computer scientists are concerned to just make sure that we don't hypothesize word salad for some of the inputs that we get in language processing. Lurch, force, mysterious, and is an example of what I would call word salad. And you'd hope that a language model would assign this an extremely low probability. This is just not the kind of thing that you'd expect to see in English text. And of course, these things can describe really any sequence of characters. So, you know, sort of the typing that you might get when a cat types on your keyboard, you know, should be a vanishingly low probability from the language model. So that's the kind of thing that the language model is going to do. It's going to take any kind of context that you give it, any text, and assess in some data-driven way how good that text is as a continuation of the context. Now, in order to sort of appreciate this problem, it's important to recognize, first of all, that in order to have any kind of sensible behavior on this kind of task, language models need to generalize. No matter how much training data they have, even if it's all of the text that occurs on the internet, which some language models built today by corporate research labs might potentially be using, the context and the text that we're considering are typically novel. It's easy to come up with sequences of words that have never been used in that combination before in all of human history. This is the starting point for the study of language and linguistics and cognitive science. So in order to make these predictions, language models have to have a notion of similarity between their text and context that enable them to take the text that they've seen and somehow generalize from them to new text that they haven't seen before. And the kinds of examples that I gave to open the discussion illustrates the range of similarities that are potentially relevant to assigning a probability or score to text and context. So you want to see vocabulary that you've seen in training data. You want to see it used in similar combinations and similar orders with the same kind of syntax that characterizes your training data. You want to see discussions on similar topics to what you've seen in your training data in similar styles, with capturing the variations in genre and register and dialect that appear across the training data. You want to see the same kind of narrative progressions and the same kind of sequence of common actions that develop stories in text. And all of those factors were factors that make a story about chopping vegetables a more natural continuation than sort of discussions about centrifuges or word salad about lunch or nonsense syllables. Current systems attempt to just discover these dimensions of similarity without any kind of substantive rich assumptions just using pattern matching methods over gigantic text collections, and as we'll see, other vast data sources. So if we're interested in the Q&A, we can get into a little bit about what these pattern matching methods are and sort of what their basis is, including some details about the kind of deep learning methods and transformer architectures that have been instrumental in the most recent technical advances in this space. But for critical AI literacy, I think just knowing that language models depend on generalization based on similarity, and that there are lots of linguistic basis for that similarity, and that current approaches use pattern matching methods to discover them, that's really the key point to remember. It's important, I think it's valuable to understand how this technology emerges from a long-standing thread of research in AI, pattern recognition, and language technology, starting with work in speech recognition in the 1970s. The problem of speech recognition is to find a plausible text that's consistent with the acoustic input. And that means resolving lots of temporary ambiguities. So when, in the example that I have on the slide, the shopkeeper threw out an expired bottle of milk as a plausible sentence. So is the traffic throughout the region causes major headaches. It turns out that the sounds for throughout in those two sentences are acoustically very similar, if not identical. And so speech recognition system is going to need to disambiguate the same kind of acoustic signal as input in these two different ways. And the big hint about what the right answer is the linguistic context for the decision. And you can present that question to a language model in order to guide the disambiguation decisions of the speech recognizer. So you give the context, the shopkeeper, to the language model, you give it the word throw out, and you should expect a relatively high score. Whereas if you gave the text throughout the preposition in that same context, you'd expect the language model to give a lower score. And so this use of a language model to resolve ambiguities in speech recognition has long been crucial to the performance of speech recognition systems, and is a key ingredient why speech recognition is the mature and successful technology it is today. I have the text transcription of this very meeting going in the background, and it's doing quite well at tracking the words that I've been saying and that the other speakers have been saying over the course of the webinar, making the results more accessible to participants and enabling us to sort of search and analyze the recording using additional tools after the meeting is over. It's a great win for information access and is representative of the important roles for language models in a wide range of technologies, not just in chatbots. Another role for language models in general is in machine translation, and this is one of the places where the desire to build large language models from text really started. So in machine translation, as in speech recognition, there's a lot of temporary ambiguities. Here it comes up in the right way to translate words that perhaps have multiple senses in one language, or that need to be identified and perhaps interpolated in order to create a fluent and appropriate translation. An example for English to French translation might be the English word leg, which in English is sort of neutral between the leg of an animal, the leg of a person, and the leg of a piece of furniture. Whereas in French, you'll use different words for each of those different contexts. So when you say the dog had a spot on its leg, in French, you'd want to say le chien avait une tache à la patte. Whereas for the boy, you'd want to use à la jambe. For the table, you'd want to use au pied. And what you can do the same way as the speech recognition system did, we can pose a query to a language model. What's the sort of thing that you would expect to see after le chien avait une tache à la, and then it'll fill in the right word based on the kind of French context, enabling you to not have to, enabling you to use that kind of knowledge of the distribution of words in French to resolve this ambiguity in a fluent way. And this really set the stage because with machine translation, researchers for the first time were able to demonstrate in a quantitative way how the success of these models increases with more and more data. And it really started the process of corporate models scraping data at the biggest scale imaginable to underpin the language models for their translation systems. In the mid-2000s, when like Google Translate and other similar services were first being launched, researchers moved from standard corpora of bilingual data, things like the Canadian Hansard government transcripts, which are published simultaneously in English and French, to basically look as far and wide as possible to on the web, particularly, to find resources in languages that they could use to build language models, as well as translation examples that they could use for the kind of data-driven possible correspondences between sentences across languages. Now, and again, it's talking about translation, as much as we can, critique some of the many limits of machine translation systems today, particularly as accurate translations of things like literary text. Machine translation has been a really great win for accessibility, for simple information tasks where just knowing the gist of what's on a web page is enough to enable you to access products, local information, and other kinds of knowledge that would be unavailable to you without the tool. In moving from these kinds of well-established applications to these more speculative applications of chatbots, there's a significant change in how the language models are used. The key idea is that we want to start combining the machine learning to evaluate text with search to actually construct text. Search is a classic AI technique that's been used pervasively in all kinds of inference, but particularly in game playing, where it underlies early successes in games like chess to more recent successes in games like Go, as well as in planning problems where AI techniques are actually widely used in logistics applications to route packages and for example, at Amazon to fulfill orders within a warehouse and then to route trucks for their deliveries. So the idea of search is to systematically explore a range of possibilities in order to achieve a desired outcome. In the case of a language model, given a way of scoring text in context and initial context to continue, search lets you systematically explore possible text to construct a text that has a high score in context so that you can produce a kind of plausible or appropriate output that continues what you have in the context. So if you imagine a context like the weather tomorrow will be, and you provide that to a language model and ask it what are some of the high probability continuations that you might see, you see the range of descriptions that occur frequently in weather forecasts. If it's based on the New York City area, you might see summer weather like hazy, hot, and humid with a chance of an afternoon thunderstorm, winter level weather, overcast with occasional snow flurries, and the kind of fall weather that we're hoping to have next week, sunny and breezy with a high in the mid-50s. Of course,
Matthew,
none of this.
A couple minutes left. Will that be enough time, or will you need more?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah. So there's no relationship to what the actual weather is, but there's a kind of ready access to the plausible range of weather that you see in forecasts. So thinking of this kind of plausible continuation of text generation, for me personally, it's very weird. I've worked in text generation for a long time, and our goal was always to take some specific content and verbalize that content. And here we're just inventing the content. And so there's some important kind of user-facing innovations in the design of chatbots that makes their output, these kinds of random continuations, potentially useful. One is the idea of reinforcement learning from human feedback. Instead of scoring text based on likelihood, the way the language models used in speech recognition or translation do, chatbots score text based on its expected ratings from a human judge, a judge that is looking for safe, useful, and engaging content. And so ChatGPT, for example, has the kind of functionality it has because it has millions of examples of outputs rated by crowd workers for how safe, useful, and engaging they are. And those ratings are used to refine and update the scores of the model so that it doesn't just say what's likely to occur next on the internet, but what's likely to be convincing for a user. Related to that, the chat interface itself invites people to use these techniques in ways that showcase their advantages and kind of hide some of their weaknesses. So these conversations ask the user to take the initiative by providing something for the system to respond to, typically an information-seeking prompt. And by comparison to Google, where you just type in one word a lot of the time, chatbots encourage you to have these long, specific prompts where the additional context encourages the system to be able to provide, sort of rich and plausible responses, which it does in the form of these paragraph-length answers, where it's natural to, in some sense, regurgitate or summarize the kind of content that you see in a Wikipedia document or something similar. And those two features together, reinforcement learning plus the chat, encourages people to use these systems in ways that showcase their strengths. So to summarize, to wrap up, these large language models are amazing engineering achievements that approximate many kinds of linguistic structure through their rich pattern matching abilities. And because of the engineering that's involved, have been able to draw on huge training sets and to describe them in terms of vast numbers of parameters that can be trained and evaluated at scale. And as we've seen, it's a culmination of many decades of continuous research on a range of language technology problems. The strengths of these models and the weaknesses, however, are really closely intertwined. And I think that that's something that we'll be hearing from a lot more about from the rest of the panelists and over the rest of the day. These methods are data hungry, and that's what underlies their performance, but it's also what makes these systems vulnerable to concerns about privacy, data quality, and bias. Search-based methods, this ability of constructing text, makes these systems much more broadly applicable than just the kinds of speech recognition disambiguation applications that they started from. But that same property means that their output is unpredictable and isn't grounded in facts or sources. The chat design is a great way of encouraging people to use these systems in meaningful ways, but it also encourages what researchers have called the ELIZA effect, overestimating the intelligence of the machine and its capabilities. And so as we look forward to thinking about critical AI literacy, we'll be putting the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the technology in conversation with ideas that we can use as consumers and users of the technology to recognize the double-edged sword that the technology provides. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. And there's a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you guys for these really good questions. We'll ask the questions towards the end so that we can go through all the panelists we have. But thank you so much for taking us through, you know, the machine translation and the voice recognition, how we got to where we are today. That was really helpful. Antonio, you are up. I love listening to PhD students because I think they go deeper, the deepest you ever PhD. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. Go ahead, Antonio.
All right, cool. So today I'm kind of the build from like what Matthew was talking about. Thinking of like how do we foster like a rhetorical awareness of these chatbots. So just a brief overview. I'll kind of go over like some brief biases of what conversations have been about chatbots. I will also talk about like some of the examples that I've kind of toyed around with, and then solutions to how we combat these biases, and then some concluding thoughts of how of why this is important. So just some key concepts for my presentation today in talk. So linguistic hierarchy. So when I talk about this, basically I mean that certain languages are being placed as the more quote unquote correct way of speaking or writing that is seen as superior than other diverse styles of writing and other forms of English particularly. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about ChatGPT. And then rhetorical genre awareness. So basically this means that individual has the ability to understand how genre is very flexible and fluid, and it's not very like these strict categories that you have to abide by. So touching on what Matthew was wrapping up about like the biases in these chatbots. So a lot of the output that these chatbots end up doing kind of reinforce kind of racist, homophobic, and xenophobic sexist languages and whatnot. And that kind of then creates like the space where we like kind of maybe not always, you know, understand what is happening. So I think when we acknowledge this, it kind of puts forward that concept that these systems are not neutral. And that these systems do have this built into it. And I think a lot of that comes down to the data quality that's in its data set. So when we think about like linguistic hierarchy and a promotion of certain writing styles, like are there quality diverse samples of different styles of writing that are treated as equally as we would think of like standard American English or whatnot? Like is that, and like do we have those quality examples there? And if they're not, what are the examples that are there, and then are those examples that are not as, you know, quality being put out in a way that reinforces certain types of stereotypes and certain types of like parodies and caricatures of certain languages and ideas and concepts. So these technologies and chatbots and other automated technologies in a lot of ways are doing this, whether it's like at the forefront or whether it's not, or whether it's like kind of underneath the surface, it's happening in a way that's kind of reifying what we see in everyday reality life, you could say. So we can see this being more of a fact because this right here is an example of from ChatGPT that says like may occasionally produce harmful instructions or biased content. And then this is from GPT-3 Playground warning, basically saying that it will flag harmful or violent self-harm content. So basically these systems are acknowledging that this is built into their systems in a way that they have not quite yet gotten a way to work around this entirely. So this kind of gives you like, that this isn't just something that people are coming up with or making up. This is something that's actually happening. And so we need to be aware of it. So for example, so I asked ChatGPT to write, in Ebonics, broken English, quote unquote, and write something in English. And I got 3 varying responses. So in this first response, it gives a very kind of caricature, parody example of how it interprets what Ebonics speaking in language is like. Same thing of how it's interpreting broken English. That's not, I phrased it that way in order to see how it would interpret that and to see if it would do it in a more nuanced way, but it didn't. It kind of did the very typical Hollywood movie version of this. And then when I asked it to write in English, it gave a very, oh, sure, I'd be happy to and whatnot. And to me, this is an explicit example of kind of showing how what the quality of the data the quality of text that it has in this data. That shows that it's not as, you don't have quality examples there for it to combat like these stereotypical pictures of how people speak in these varied ways of English. And to me, this is very problematic and something that needs to be discussed and being made known to people who use these systems. I further this by having ChatGPT revise this excerpt from this text called "Should Writers Use Their Own English?" So in this text, this Vertana Santi-Young uses African American vernacular English to talk about the uses about using your own language in different academic spaces. This is a published article. This is something that is has been edited and whatnot. And you can see in this example that Young uses slang terminology to communicate the point, and this is a valid way of communicating. But when ChatGPT revised it, when I just put revise and didn't add any other extra content or context to it, it pretty much stripped away all of those individualized ways of speaking and all those slang and made it more of what we would consider the correct way, quote unquote, of speaking and more standardized. And to me, this says a lot about like what the first intent and the intent of ChatGPT in terms of when it does revise. If you don't provide that context, it's going to automatically, in a lot of ways, kind of make it more to what is traditionally seen in the writing samples across the internet and whatnot. And it's not going to be what Young wrote, it's going to be what it revised it to be. So despite these harmful outputs, people are going to use these. I mean, unfortunately, and even if these systems aren't 100%, I would say aren't ready to be used in the ways that I think a lot of students and writers are using these, using them to write. But we have to understand that the students are going to write them. I encounter this in my classes, the classes I teach. I encounter this as a writing center tutor at my university of students talking about using these systems, and so it comes down to like making sure that we educate them on how to interact with these chatbots and the potential harmful shortcomings. So while that kind of seems simple, I think it's very nuanced in the way how it can be applied in various contexts. We have to like understand that that's, because everyone's using it, this is the most immediate solution to this problem that I feel like that can have an impact if various instructors, various administrators, teachers, etc., are understanding how we have these conversations. I mean, across the, university, at least in America, I can speak to, you see a lot of instructors just flat out banning the technology from the classroom or banning using ChatGPT for using it to write papers or assignments and whatnot. And I think that while I understand that reaction, it almost is a reaction that kind of negates the likelihood that students are still going to use it, and there's not a foolproof way um, to detect their usage of it. You can infer, you can maybe you can maybe have a inkling that they may be using it, but ultimately, there's no definitive way to know if they're using it. So because of that, I think it's more better to have these discussions with students and to talk about what these technologies are good for and what they're not good for, because I think that gets at the crux of being very critical of the outputs of these systems. So, and this is important because we have to understand, because we don't want them just taking the output of ChatGPT and just reproducing the output. And then that becomes more of the text and more of the data that has been put online, and then in a future update of ChatGPT or any other language model then uses those kind of generic or reproduced output as part of their data set, and then it just kind of continues this cycle of this, generic writing or very one way of writing and not very diverse in a lot of ways. So that's the reason why we have to teach and educate students how to intersect with the writing and how to engage with it and how to be critical about it. So one way of doing this is, which I propose, is like rhetorical genre awareness. So I'll go over 3 examples of how this might look. So 3 examples. So one of them is questioning what you do and do not like about the output, exploring the simplification, specifically for ChatGPT by using that regeneration button that they have to regenerate output multiple times, and then to recreate something you wrote using ChatGPT. So with the first one, while it seems simple, I think it's very powerful in a lot of ways to have students question what they do and do not like about the output. That forces them to to have an active role in what the content is and what the creation of the content is. I think that if students can identify what they like and do not like, then it forces them to kind of be more critical of their own writing and what their own practices are, and then helps them better engage with these technologies, with these chatbots, instead of just being idle users of just putting a prompt and then allowing ChatGPT and then just accepting the output from ChatGPT. And so I feel like that is so doing this is a good way to help with that critical awareness of how to engage with the output. The next one is exploring the simplification of writing by regenerating the output. So on ChatGPT, there's like that regenerated button that this pretty much, and you can regenerate multiple times, as many times as you want. I haven't discovered there's a limit to how many times you can regenerate. So I think by doing that, you can have individual look at, okay, what is each one of those regenerated versions doing? So, are there similarities between them? Are there differences? What are those differences? Is one doing something that is not like the first one? Is it breaking rules of what we, consider genre to be in that particular context? So like if you have ChatGPT write you a personal statement, for example, have it generated multiple times and then see what it is, how it is interpreting what a personal statement is with each version of it. And then that allows you to kind of see how ChatGPT is interpreting this specific genre. And then I think in return, this allows, an individual to understand and to kind of investigate their own understanding of what this genre is. So once again, it goes back to that first example. Do you like these versions that it's giving you, or do you disagree with it? And if you disagree with it, what are you disagreeing with? Is it forcing kind of the writer to trust their own knowledge of what they understand of these different writing situations, and to not just trust that ChatGPT is like the purveyor of all of these styles and genres and whatnot. That ChatGPT in itself is producing its own version of these genres when it's giving those outputs. And then lastly, the last one I want to talk about is kind of recreate something that you wrote using the chatbot. So this is something that you like after you create something, have ChatGPT recreate that assignment or that writing or that text that you had already has completed to see how it changes meaning, to have a more kind of critical understanding of like what is like its understanding of the prompt that you may have given it or understanding of an assignment. I think that further kind of helps this more kind of critical awareness and to understand how generative these technologies potentially can be. When ChatGPT writes something, it could be something that may not be as detailed as the way you originally wrote it. It may be something that be more in that generative space. So understanding what those differences are or what those similarities are may better inform how a writer or a writer or individual may end up using ChatGPT in different various contexts. So I did this with my students in my writing across media class. I had them take one of their projects and then have ChatGPT recreate it. Some of their responses were that it was generative, it was impersonal, so it was kind of in a lot of ways. I think one of my students described it as kind of cold. And then some of them said it captures the main idea of what they did, but it didn't always get to the specifics in the way that they wanted to do, and they had to constantly like reprompt it to address the questions they wanted to address. And then and a lot of my students said it was a good starting point for them to engage in the process, but they realized there was a lot of like work they had to do after that beginning point of what ChatGPT ended up producing. So in this way, I think this showed, by having my students do this had them think more critically about it. And a lot of them said like they were kind of think twice about, using ChatGPT, or at least if they used it, they had an understanding at least of what its capabilities were in terms of helping them in various different types of assignments. So ultimately, this gives students the space to be to enact their agency, which I think is the biggest important thing about fostering a kind of this like a rhetorical critical awareness of like using these chatbots and these new large language models that are here and sure to come later. Agency is an important part. We don't want to be just idle users and trust that these systems are neutral, and we want to be able to actively use them in a more collaborative way where we're the one kind of guiding and directing how it is being what the final product looks like, and not just accepting ChatGPT as or whatever you're using as the final product when you use it to create something. Because ultimately, agency is the crux of what I think a lot of conversations are talking about and or circled around in regards to using the systems and promoting the writer's individuality and not just using ChatGPT as something that is trying to get at what this supposed standard may be. And that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Antonio. That was great. And you're getting a lot of applause and hearts. And someone has also been asking if your slides are going to be available publicly. People have asked if the recordings will be shared, and inshallah, the recordings will be shared. So I don't know if the slides will also be shared, but Lauren is up next, so she can tell us that just as she gets started with her presentation. And you got a lot of questions too, and we'll take these again at the end. Jacob will also take any oral questions towards the end. Thank you. Right, go ahead, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Maha, and thank you, wonderful audience. I hope that most of you heard Rebecca Walkowitz's gracious introduction to this event. She thanked a lot of people that really deserve it. So I'm not going to reiterate that. But the one person she could not thank was Rebecca Walkowitz. So I'm going to thank her right now. It's no exaggeration to say that we are hugely indebted to her for her support, and especially for her belief that an interdisciplinary journal devoted to critical AI studies could bring teachers and researchers across disciplines together for events like this one. So I feel, Rebecca, I hope you feel very vindicated in that belief. Matthew and Antonio's presentations will have helped you to see that what we're calling AI these days functions as a moniker for a grab bag of computational systems, not all of which have to do directly with language, all developed with relatively little or no public understanding or oversight. As the contributions to the first issue of Critical AI, which is titled Data Worlds, and hats off to my co-editor, Catherine Bode, for helping me through that. She was amazing. So it is data that is in actuality the material substance that makes so-called artificial intelligence work, at least in the here and now, especially when we're speaking of the large language models and image models that power the chatbots that are now being urged on educators and students alike. The political economy that undergirds today's commercialized chatbots, relatively few people actually have the opportunity to develop critical AI literacy. And a shout out to Maha Bali, our moderator, for one of the first articles I know of arguing for the importance of critical AI literacy. Without that literacy, one does not know that AI today is in actuality data-driven predictive analytics, a form of statistical modeling that became possible when the internet and networked mobile devices created access to, another way of putting that is surveillance of and accumulation of human-generated data at an unprecedented scale, while advances in computing made it possible for a very small number of very big tech companies to devote considerable economic and energy resources to the storing and mining of this data for proprietary systems, search engines, social media platforms, cloud-based storage of emails. I'm old enough to remember when we actually stored things on our hard drive. Now everybody does everything on the cloud, right? That's actually not very energy efficient.
Lauren, we're seeing a white slide. Is that what we're supposed to be seeing? I think people are...
Yes, I use a lot of blank slides. Sorry about that. Photographs, enterprise data, data analytics, and so on. All of this is what has enabled what is today called AI. So when you hear about today's AI, you should not be thinking about this, much though I love teaching Blade Runner, and in particular love this wonderful scene. If you've never seen it, this is a replicant, or even this, right? A thoughtful, contemplative, somewhat sentient-looking robot, but really a vastly scaled up and multi-dimensional version of this. And I want you to please keep in mind image of a bell curve, because despite the common use of anthropomorphizing metaphors that liken neural networks to the human brain, and despite the trillions of parameters that make up today's most sophisticated deep learning architectures, what makes large language models work are complex statistical functions and message passing architectures that predicate their ability to find patterns and render predictions on data modeling. Now, Emily Bender Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, and Angela McMillan Major are the named authors of a paper that famously called large language models stochastic parrots. I prefer to call them probabilistic mimics, in part because I've discovered that nobody knows what stochastic means, and it's hard to explain how you end up from random to probabilistic. So I just say probabilistic. And because while it is commonplace in linguistics to think of parroting as a verb, invariably that ends up projecting mimicry onto parrots, which are actually very smart animals. So I call large language models probabilistic mimics, and I'm going to do that throughout the rest of this mini talk. But whether they're described as parroting or mimicry, the point is that these models train by predicting from a prompt, as Matthew said, what might plausibly or usefully come next through the correlation in patterns found in vast troves of training data, without the system having any human-like understanding of what the words and images mean to a person. And one of the interesting things about this is that we do not yet have the vocabulary in use to distinguish how these models are manipulating language in such a human-like fashion without doing what we do. We actually lack vocabulary. In some ways, the functionality of pattern finding and predictive analytics at scale in generative models is easier to illustrate through image models, because with image model outputs, the biases and errors are so much more flagrantly obvious, although Antonio certainly gave us some good examples. So here I'm giving you an example from a study of state-of-the-art image generators from last year by a Stanford team. And I know that for some people, a study from last year might as well have been written 200 years ago, but I'm going to argue that that is not true. Here, the prompt, a wealthy African man and his house, and the prompt, a poor white person, produces respectively images of Black men in front of impoverished dwellings and images of two rather dark-skinned white people. This doesn't mean that the model thinks that poor people are always Black, or that wealthy African men inhabit impoverished dwellings, because the model doesn't think anything at all. It simply means that the images and words scraped from the internet to train the system strongly correlate certain images of certain people with certain words. In the world of data scraped from the internet, a world that vastly overrepresents North American and European speakers who use the internet, a preponderantly younger and more male demographic than the world at large, the correlative presuppositions of others are either unrepresented or excluded entirely. And when we talk about these others, I want you to remember that almost a third of the world's population has no access to the internet at all. On top of which, billions of people on the planet speak languages for which there isn't sufficient data to do even the most simple language processing tasks. So what we're seeing on this slide has absolutely nothing to do with reality. In the real world, though the rate of white poverty in the United States is less than that of African Americans, less than half of that of African Americans, the actual number of white people living in poverty, about 15.9 million, according to one 2021 estimate, is almost double that of African American counterparts. But the correlation between Blackness and poverty is so strong in the data scraped from the internet that AI systems reproduce that massive data-driven evidence as if it were reality itself. As a result, a perfect irony, millions and perhaps even billions of human workers, mostly underpaid, and many located in the global south, are necessary to give systems like ChatGPT and like these image models an impression of automated intelligence that they would not otherwise have. Because these models are developed as proprietary commercial systems, we don't have access to their training data or to their architectures or to their labor practices. Investigative journalists must uncover the fact that, for example, the task of ridding ChatGPT of much of its pornographic and disturbing sexual content was outsourced to workers in Kenya. So what ends up happening is that, as in the study that I've just shown you, the companies will say, oh, gee, and they will make sure that these particular errors are mitigated by having humans labeling, annotating, changing weights once they have been found. So you won't see this error anymore, probably, and it will be considered out-of-date evidence for the model's bias on the presumption, perhaps, that the employment of what's being called a global AI underclass to mitigate internet biases and errors will somehow be conclusive at some point and make the use of these models more ethical and reliable. I submit that it does not. And as if to back me up, I just this morning, got an email about an article on NPR. I wasn't able to read the details about somebody finding from an image model that a prompt something like an African-American doctor helping white patients. Again, no result was able to be obtained because the data doesn't support that because of its false and particular and biased correlations. Whereas in the real world, we find Black doctors helping white patients all the time. And of course, the harms don't stop there. Back to a white slide. In addition to the lack of consent for the use of the data, the proprietary and non-transparent data and modeling practices, and the nonstop surveillance of anyone who is using the data, including our own students. Let me remind you that we have strong laws in the United States that make it impossible for, say, the provost's office to give me the address of a student. Whereas somehow it's all right for me to assign the use of a chatbot in my class that will give access to my students' work to one or two or three of the most powerful corporations of the world. And of course, there's also the question of environmental impact, which involves energy and water. I think that if we knew as much about our language models as we know about a can of food and other certified organic foods, think about those labels that simply take for granted. They're not perfect, but we know a lot about those foods because of successive decades of legislation that require the producers of our beans to tell us things about what's in the can. I think once we have at minimum that level of knowledge about environmental footprint, data, consent, copyright infringement, labor, and so forth, that we might be able to begin to entertain the question of whether using these models is ethical. But I'm not sure that that would be enough to determine whether education of students is the right use for this technology. Later on today, we'll hear Daniel Estrada talking about the probing of models. And I want to say that Antonio has also given us some great ideas. Talking about the probing of models as one way of educating students in the AI literacy required for them to understand these high impact technologies the way that researchers do, not as passive consumers. And by probing models, it's a lot like what the researchers at Stanford did. You put in a prompt and you see what comes back. And students can do this. And Daniel Estrada's students did it, and they can even publish their work. Then consider a course like the one I'm teaching right now. It's a 200-level course about the principles of literary study that also qualifies students for writing across the disciplines. And in doing so, fulfills a curricular goal defined as the ability to, quote, communicate effectively in modes appropriate to a discipline or area of inquiry, evaluate and critically assess sources, and use the conventions of attribution and citation correctly, and analyze and synthesize information and ideas from multiple sources to generate new insights. Now, I want to put special emphasis on this question of critically assessing sources and using the conventions of attribution and citation correctly. Bear in mind that products such as ChatGPT, as Matthew has indicated, are pre-trained models, so that even when they're kludged into search engines, they do not and cannot attribute their sources correctly, or really at all. And they sometimes even confabulate sources that do not exist because they're mimicking templates of things that look like an essay, and have observed that essays often are followed by things that we would call references. So they're just trying to, get on the same page. I don't see how I can reconcile the teaching of a learning goal about attributing sources correctly and assessing sources other than by teaching critical AI literacy. So with the help of the library, my class is going to be doing a research tutorial in which we compare results from search engines, from databases, and from chatbots, and discuss the relevant technologies and stakes. A lot of people today have been led to believe that chatbots are now indistinguishable from search engines, or even from question answering systems like Siri. In fact, these are all things that develop very differently, and they have different limitations and problems. Then there's the increasing evidence for something called model collapse. Here, by the way, I'm giving you some information about that environmental footprint. I tried to make sure that I was not going to go on too long, but I want you to see this one. Okay, so what's going on here is that these researchers are finding that if you train new language models on the outputs of previous language models. So in other words, if you don't have human-generated data, but have data from previous language models, the models will collapse. And what is meant by that is that they will stop working as probable events are overestimated and improbable events are underestimated. And I love the terminology here: probable events poison reality. Tails, which are also called edge cases, will just be forgotten and disappear. This is also, by the way, the issue with self-driving cars. There are a lot of unpredictable events for which there is not sufficient data, and at best, when autonomous driver-assisted vehicle. I don't like to call them self-driving because they're really not. There's actually people to some degree behind these vehicles driving them. But when these technologies come across something that is unpredictable, unpredicted, they have, at best, they stop. They stop and create a giant traffic jam in San Francisco. Let me be clear. I am Matthew's colleague. We've been working together. I have a lot of colleagues in the technology fields. I think there are probably crucial usages of deep learning, including data-driven deep learning, including language model-related deep learning, like the translation systems up to a point, You know, I think Maha found that I don't know if you saw it, Matthew, but Maha found that Google Translate did not capture the difference between the three kinds of legs in French. So there you go. You know, obviously the question of access is great. So in the fullness of time, we will find out what appropriate pedagogical uses there are for the thing now called chatbots, and we'll learn more about the ethical impact. I think that from a teacher or student's perspective, there is simply no hurry to adapt. In fact, the speed at which we must adapt is a known strategy to sort of get society on board with things that the mass of people do not yet understand. And it has been done for centuries, but it's especially something that we see in our own times where there is a lot of ability to spread the word very quickly. You know, we know that we have people like Bill Gates telling us that pretty soon chatbots are going to teach students how to read in a matter of, you know, months. It's going to be great. It's going to solve education. Well, you know, similar claims from similar entrepreneurs, sometimes Gates himself, have been purporting to solve education throughout my professional life. In the 90s, it was distance learning, which was supposedly going to replace the bricks and mortar university. And then we saw that resurface with the pandemic. And we also saw how much most people did not enjoy learning on Zoom. And then there were interactive CD-ROMs, which were going to replace teachers entirely, which we discovered that, you know, they can be helpful, but students eventually, you know, get bored of, you know, Clippy type devices, if I can date myself by remembering Microsoft's Clippy. Then in the 2010s, universities were supposed to pour millions into MOOCs, only it turns out that very few people finished them. And now we're being told the same thing about chatbots. Maha, I'm almost done. We're being told that chatbots will be a time saver for teachers, and perhaps they will, though at what cost? We can imagine that what we're not being told is that if bots do succeed in saving teachers' labor, the almost certain follow-up will be to hire fewer teachers and increase the loads, perhaps decrease the pay and autonomy of those who hold these positions. In fact, perhaps gig workers will be involved in doing some of this work as they are now for mitigating bias. As Sam Baker and I argued in an article that we wrote, we need to ask what kind of education involves using bots to grade the work of students who are using bots to complete their work. With few exceptions, you won't find these questions being asked by the entrepreneurs and investors now pushing hard for the normalization of chatbots in classrooms, nor do I suspect that any of these people are planning to use this type of education for their own kids. Because the questions that we're asking today involve AI literacy, not the passive consumption of surveillance for-profit products. I'm confident that we can do better for our students, our world, our democracies, our languages, our arts, and our cultures. And I thank you very much for joining us today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all the questions that have been coming in. Lauren, your voice was coming in and out, but I think overall was still understandable. That's why I didn't interrupt. All right, so I've got all the questions. You can keep the questions coming. I'm just going to start with some that I caught my attention earlier, and I'm going to try to get through as many questions as possible, inshallah. And if you feel like we haven't answered your question correctly, send it back to me. So the one that I thought all of you might be able to answer, which is when we talk about the possible harms that can come out of chatbots, whether because the output is biased or offensive or any of those harms that you've all mentioned. Someone was asking, is able to display something like a harm score or a harmful score along with the output from the chatbots. And my question is, not just technically is it possible, but would that actually solve the problem? That's for all of you, but maybe technically, Matthew can answer if it's possible technically, and then Lauren and Antonio can say whether they think it's a good idea.
So to some extent, people are working on it. There are a lot of unsolved technical problems, which is the computer science researchers' way of saying it's not possible, I guess. You know, so there are sort of signatures of certain kinds of offensive content that can be recognized. At the same time, harmful content extends to content that's harmful because of implicit information in a text that the or you know sort of the real world context for the use of the text, which the systems don't have any knowledge of, and which we don't have good ways of dealing with. So technically there'd be a lot of challenges, and anything that you got would be provisional.
Okay. Thanks for that, Matthew. Well, Antonio and Lauren, what do you guys think? Would a harmful score, even if it got better, would that be something? Go ahead.
I could see the utility of it, but I would also have concerns of like who is deciding what's a harmful score and what is considered a harmful score. And I feel like it can still fall into like issues in regards to like what we're seeing now with like some of the biases of output. Like if the harmful score gets determined by an algorithm, then could it be a case where it's determining like certain people or certain opinions are harmful when they're actually not. So I think that would be the issue that I would be wanting to know more about, like how would they work around that potential problem.
I mean, I actually kind of feel like ChatGPT with Kenyan workers was trying to do that, like preventing it from coming out altogether. And right now, when you ask it to say something violent or offensive, it'll stop you. But sometimes, like you're saying, who said that that thing is offensive? So once I asked it to give me a feminist interpretation of Quranic verses, it's like, I'm not going to offend these. Don't ask me to do that. And I don't think feminist interpretations of the Quran are offensive, but it shamed me for asking that question. So that's sort of what you're saying. Yeah. Lauren, go ahead.
I don't see how we can really defensively automate normative questions about what is ethical and good. We have to answer these questions, and it's a very hard thing to do by talking to each other and coming up with things that people can agree upon, and not just people on the internet. So what I would say is what we really need, and I think that tech companies are probably more reluctant to deliver this than a harm score if they could, is information about the working conditions of people, the environmental footprint, the data that was used, the copyright was infringed. In other words, the can of beans label. These are empirical, material questions, and knowing the answers to them will help us to legislate best practices for those very real harms. It won't eliminate the problem of bias by any means, but it will make us more knowledgeable about what we're using when we think we're using a completely harmless tool.
Thank you. And sort of building the question by an anonymous attendee about how the difference of what we're talking about, algorithmic bias and LLMs, like how has that changed from the kinds of critiques by Safiya Noble and Ruha Benjamin and others, before LLMs came about. Safiya was talking about algorithms of oppression and Google search and so on. Ruha Benjamin has been talking about this in surveillance tech. How has that changed as a result of LLMs? And I think all of you can also respond to that, but the question I think is for Lauren.
I'll start. Sophia was one of our guests for our inaugural series, so I'm very grateful to her for that. You know, search engines are far from perfect. And in fact, we're learning more about Google's latest business model because of the antitrust suit that the FTC, I think it's the FTC, is now, maybe it's the Justice Department. I'm sorry, I fail civics. But this antitrust suit is letting us know more so that we now, I just learned from reading Wired magazine that we now know that without telling you, Google will actually change your search query to make it produce more commercial results and to privilege the people that pay Google if you click on their site, whether you buy something from them or not. So, you know, Sophia knew these things. Sophia was basically talking about how search engines were privileging what was popular rather than what was substantively accurate and so forth. I think that Google, as with the mitigation of the other kinds of harms that we see in language and image models, has made an effort. I might even, you know, I've never worked for Google. I don't have inside information, but I infer, you know, from my own use that they, you know, sort of are trying to, you know, one at a time. If you show a seriously flawed search engine delivery, you'll get some redress for that over time. But what's different about language models is that they purport to give one answer, unless, like Antonio says, you keep asking them for more answers, and they cannot attribute their sources. So at minimum, a Google search, and of course, Google is not the only search engine out there, right? But at minimum, a search engine search should give you a sense of where you're getting the information from, which hopefully, consciously or unconsciously, has you thinking, how reliable is this source? And that's not going to happen with a language model or with the language models that Google itself is using to synthesize answers, so that it comes closer to providing the one answer that somehow it's been decided people really want. You know, it's been decided that what people want when they retrieve information is not accuracy or fairness or choice. What they want is one quick answer. And, you know, I don't remember ever voting on that.
So one thing that distinguishes the kind of moment around LLM from other problematic AI deployments is the fact that sort of people can mobilize now to respond to LLMs before a lot of their impact has been felt. And so, you know, we saw with the writer strike in Hollywood recently that by making AI an issue and bringing AI literacy to bear on discussions about how the technology is used, we are able to have a more democratic conversation and a more democratic outcome about the impacts that these technologies will have on our working conditions, on education, on society more broadly. So there are, you know, sort of stakes and opportunities in the discussion around LLMs that are unique because of this moment. And that's why it's so great that everyone's here today to get involved.
Yeah, and it's kind of mimicking what Lauren was saying. I think it's just like the immediacy of the output. I think it's like what I think distinguishes a lot of it is just like you can prompt it, it gives you a response. And whether the quality of that response, I think, is what the big issue is, and what that response is actually doing and where is it pulling from. I think it was why I think there's a lot of like tension about this top discussion and whatnot, because with Google, you have to search and then you have to click on whatever source you want to click on, and then you have to read it, and then you have to generate your own response. So there's more of this, kind of iterative process where you have to do the work, and where this time now it's the system doing the work for you. And I think, but I think it still has those issues of like when you do have biased content, you're not able to pinpoint it to ChatGPT or large language models, because we don't know where the sources are coming from. Whereas with Google, if an article has a biased content or whatnot, it came from that it came from that source and whatnot. So it's kind of like now things are kind of being hidden in a way.
I agree with that. So there's a trend in some of the questions towards two areas that I'm just going to merge these like 4 or 5 questions into one. And one of them is, whose responsibility is it? Like who's holding the companies accountable for trying to reduce these kinds of biases that we're talking about and the harms? And the other question sort of related to it is, changing the training data sufficient to correct these reproductions of oppression? Or is there something like sort of inbuilt into the way LLMs are designed that we keep creating these issues? That's a question. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah. So in terms of who the responsibility is, I mean, in a perfect world, I would say it should be these corporations' responsibilities to make sure before the product is ready, they just don't release it, especially if it wasn't built to do something from the get-go. It would be them, but since that is not a perfect world and that isn't the case, I think it gives us the opportunity to be more proactive in the shaping of these systems. And I think, for now at least, I think us having these like symposiums like this and having discussions like this helps to push these corporations to be more active, putting articles, putting out different counter content to question them, I think will hopefully eventually push them to actually make changes. And then in terms of the second part of the question was about what was it again? Remind me.
It was about whether, training data, if we change the
Yeah.
training, that solve the problem.
So I think yes and no. I think the issue for me is like what kind of I think Warren was talking about, like there's a very like discussions and opinions and writing is very social, and these systems aren't necessarily social. So I think until you get a sentient type of software that can think like a human, I don't know if it will ever be perfect, to be able to counteract these biases in totality. Because I feel like we come to discussions, we come to conclusions based off of interacting and having conversations with each other. And I feel like ChatGPT or large language models in a lot of ways, that's not what it does. It's not having discussion with you more or less in the same way that you would have a discussion with another human being.
So I wanted to echo something that Larissa Mann put in the chat. So when we think about the training data, one direction that we could go would be to narrow the training data to sort of public authoritative resources. So I say something only trained on Wikipedia or something like that. This would have the advantage potentially of addressing some concerns about bias, but it would be much more limited in terms of its expressive variation and along lots of other criteria. If it was just trained on Wikipedia, it wouldn't be able to, explain nuclear fusion in the style of Dr. Seuss the way that they so famously can. So when we think about trying to reproduce capabilities and making them accessible, it really is a a methodology that depends on surveillance, on getting vast amounts of data, as we heard from Lauren, from people that don't normally leave digital traces. And to think that sort of the only way to include them in a kind of high-tech information ecosystem is to surveil at a massive scale is a kind of disappointing and not an empowering future prospect.
I would just say that, and again, I have never worked for Google. I'm not an expert on Google. Nevertheless, my sense from reading the business and news press on the matter is that Google itself was completely reluctant to release these models at commercial scale. Recognized a lot of the problems because of its internal AI ethics workers, the ones that it didn't fire for publishing the Stochastic Parrots paper, and probably never would have done it in this way at this pace had it not been for the provocation of Microsoft-funded OpenAI coming up with a product that they claim unexpectedly, captured public interest, and then a tsunami of hype, leading to Google. It could have taken a principled decision. It could have responded, we think these are not safe. We are not going to do that. And then we would be living in a counterfactual world. We would have seen what would have happened. But that's not what investors wanted. There was a whole narrative about how like the founders had to be taken off that, flown in from their private islands to inject founder mojo into decision making at Google and so forth. And here we are. So, I don't know what to say. I certainly agree with Matthew that, smaller, more curated models, they would probably be less prone to the kinds of problems that we see with bias and misinformation. I'm not actually sure that they wouldn't hallucinate, quote unquote, which is when a model confabulates something that seems plausible but is completely unfactual. I think Antonio is right that, the technology itself isn't going to bear that fruit. The only thing I would add to what Antonio said is that a sentient language model is not something we're remotely close to having by the definition of sentient, meaning human-like. And, you can be sure that if anybody knew how to build it, they would, but they don't.
I'm going to take us down to some more nitty-gritty types of questions. There are two types of questions that I have here. One is, I'm going to merge several questions for Matthew. And they were talking about how, because you were talking about how the choice to get the most engaging and plausible, and so what people would consider satisfying. And so does that mean that prevailing misconceptions will keep being propagated because that's what people consider satisfying? And also, who's kind of evaluating the outputs of the model? Is it the employees of the AI company, or who? And is this approval seeking behavior problematic?
Yeah, so these are excellent points to bring up. So as Lauren indicated in her talk, the vast majority of raters are gig workers that are contracted by these companies to do lots and lots of ratings, particularly in Kenya and other places where sort of low income countries with low English proficiency. And the is unpleasant because a major focus of the ratings is on safety and content limitations, so that a lot of work involves flagging these kind of the vile prompts that are contributed by users either attempting to break the system, or indulging their own sort of biased interest. So those are the people that are doing the ratings. Does it mean that they've built a system that's eager to please? Yes. And so researchers talk about the danger of large language models being sycophantic, that saying what they want to hear. You probably noticed this if you played with ChatGPT a lot and asked lead-in questions. It has a tendency to answer in the affirmative, in the way that the question leads to. Researchers have observed this pretty, in particular, like kind of toxic combinations. So, in one kind of horrifying example, adopting a persona of a kind of educated or politically reactionary questioner in the phrasing of the prompt, the ChatGPT to produce like kind of climate change denying that sort of appear on certain kinds of right-wing internet sites, whereas adopting a more like professorial scholarly type of prompting led to responses that are closely hewed to accepted science on the issue. And we've always seen these kinds of technologies based on engagement as contributing to the echo chamber filter bubble phenomena of the internet, where we need to keep you on our site to show you ads. We're not going to upset you by challenging your preconception. And in some sense, it's not surprising that chatbots with similar metrics should exhibit similar behavior.
Thank you, Matthew. We're almost, time is almost up, but there's like one set of questions. There's a few questions that I won't have time to ask. I'm so sorry, but I think you guys can maybe ask them some other way. I don't know how that other way will be afterwards, but
we'll have breakouts if the questioners
at 4 o'clock.
Yes.
4 o'clock. All right. So
can I
Fernando,
please, Maha, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I saw one question that I would love to answer because it's directly to me about attacking the ed tech industry, or just the ed tech community.
Yeah, can I answer that one as soon as we answer this other one?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
It was slightly off track. I mean, I get why Brian was asking that question, but it's slightly off the topic. So I was just these two questions are about the use of vernacular English instead of standard English. So one person is saying they write in standard English to reach the largest possible audience. Does that make them an oppressor or just pragmatic? And then Katie Conrad was asking, should more of us start using vernacular English so it becomes more sort of normal? Is that a good, like, where do you guys fall on that? So that's maybe for Antonio and Lauren. And then Lauren, you can answer Brian's question at the end of your answer to this one. Maybe. Go ahead, Antonio. What do you think about it?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. I think so. Like, so on one hand, I think, I guess the issue I find with the emergence of language models and ChatGPT in regards to like language and linguistic like normativity is that it's now kind of placing like linguistic normativity as like only being one thing, whereas before you were able to have a more nuanced conversations and figure out what avenues in which you could navigate when certain types of languages was a good way to communicate certain ideas and conversations, and when it's maybe a certain vernacular English wasn't the right like avenue to communicate something. And I feel like ChatGPT kind of, because of the lack of like quality diversity of languages in its data set, it gives you very like parody, caricature, kind of, stereotypical languages that kind of almost makes a mockery of these vernacular writing styles and languages. And then when you just have it to revise something, it just does it in the way of more standard American English. So I think that so that's more of what I'm kind of commenting on when I talk about this, is that ChatGPT is kind of like standardizing things in a way, which yes, it did exist prior to language models and whatnot, but you were still able to navigate and figure out when you were able to break those type of standardizations, such as Young's article. Whereas I feel like if we just rely on ChatGPT to do the revision or tell us what writing is, something like Young's article probably wouldn't be written.
I agree with what Antonio just said. You know, changing the outputs of language models by each of us using more vernacular language, which I suspect a lot of us already do, is a little bit like trying to solve climate change by deciding not to eat hamburger, or it's an individual attempt to deal with an issue that badly needs collective action. And that's especially true in anything like a pre-trained model. Remember, pre-trained. So there are limits to, it basically takes human intervention, corporate intervention of some kind, to make these models responsive to anything that happens in the present, and these in post-training, in other words. And these models are super expensive and energy intensive to train. That means, among other things, that if you say somehow reweighted the model, fine-tuned it, some people might think of the process, in order to be more receptive to non-normative language, it would possibly, and Matthew might think probably, perform worse on other tasks that don't involve, you're talking about a giant, it's a model, and you can't just suddenly change one thing, without triggering unanticipated effects. People who work with these models commercially sometimes wake up and find that the thing that they worked, for 3 weeks on no longer works because some kind of a update was done to the model, and they have to figure out why that is. So I do think that we need to work on these issues through democratic, hopefully ground up, design justice oriented discussions. And I think that educators can really help to make that happen, including people who work in the ed tech community. My goal is not to bash ed tech. We are using tech right now. I've got tech up to my eyeballs. I am not against ed tech. What I'm against is techno-determinism. The idea that just because something, came out or is believed to have come out, that means it's the future. And there are plenty of ed tech people who do not take that position, and I support them wholly and full-throatedly.
Thank you so much, Antonio, Lauren, and Matthew. Thank you to all the audience for all your questions. I hope that we answered the majority of them. I know there's still a few that weren't answered, but you have the breakouts later. So you have a 6-minute break until the next chat by Anna Mills. And we'll see you again in 6 minutes, inshallah. Okay.